Do you not hear me? Oh, we're good. All right. Hosea chapter 8. Hosea chapter 8. If you didn't get a handout on the way in this morning, raise your hand. We want to make sure everybody got one. Brother Paul, all the way in the back on that side. And I think everybody's good over here, though. All right. Did I catch everybody in the middle? Good to see everybody here. Some folks have been not feeling well, been out of town. A lot of people here and there and everywhere during the summer, and I feel like I've seen a lot more faces back, so it's good to see everybody. We're going to be in Hosea chapter 8 and get right into our message today. There is a little bit of familiarity with this passage, but there's a particular point that I think is worth noting that's going to be the primary purpose of my message this morning. The book of Hosea is fairly typical in a lot of ways when it comes to the prophets, and he's giving a message to the people of Israel about how they need to recognize their unfaithfulness to God. He starts with an illustration of Hosea himself, the faithful man, marrying an immoral woman to illustrate how God, righteous and holy as he is, has covenanted with unfaithful people and chooses to extend love and acceptance regardless of their continual backsliding and rebellion. And so then in chapter 4, what he does, he gives that illustration in chapters 1 through 3 and goes back and forth between Hosea and himself for us to understand what's really happening. And then as he gets to chapter 4 and 5, he begins to outline in what ways they had been unfaithful, in what ways they had been immoral. And yet in chapters 6 and 7, he calls them back to himself. The purpose of pointing out their immorality wasn't just to make them feel bad. The purpose of pointing out their immorality was to show them that they have a problem that they need to respond to. And God still wants them back. And yet, we saw that even though there's a lot of positive things in chapter 6 and 7, come, return to the Lord. He is smitten, but he will bind us up. He will heal us. In spite of the fact that there's a lot of positive things there, the point of chapter 6 and 7 is that they don't. They don't return to the Lord. They return somewhere else. And as we continue on in the book, as we get to chapter 8 and we crest the middle of the book, he continues to outline some of these things that we're familiar with. But in this passage, he shows how it's not going well for them because they've been putting their trust in the wrong spot. Look at verse number 1. He continues to go on the theme that things aren't going well. Set the trumpet to thy mouth, which was a way to make an announcement. You would make an announcement for war, you would make an announcement to gather, but to set your trumpet to your mouth was to make an announcement that something was going to happen. He shall come as an eagle against the house of the Lord. Now, an eagle sometimes has positive connotations because he can soar and fly. You know, we will have wings as eagles. But the idea of eagle here is that it's a bird of prey. It will come and swoop down. This word in Hebrew is actually a little difficult. There's a disagreement about whether or not he means eagle or vulture, but either way, it has the idea that we are the prey. And he says the house of the Lord is. Now, he might mean like literally the temple. He might mean that in a figurative sense about the whole people of Israel. But regardless of which way that turns, he says, because of your actions, you are now becoming the prey to your circumstances. You have to look forward to things falling apart and you being the victim now. Let's move on. Because they have transgressed my covenant and trespassed against my law. Israel shall cry unto me, my God, we know thee. We have a great relationship, remember? And by the way, we know that statement's not true. Remember chapter 4? There is no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land. They didn't know God. This is a whole theme throughout this book. They had chosen not to have a relationship with God. They didn't know him, but in the time of distress, they wanted to say, hey, we're tight, aren't we? Remember that? You ever get a call from somebody? I was just spending some time with a friend of mine down in West Virginia this past week, and he was saying how he catches up with some college friends every once in a while, and he'll call them, and he'll say, the other day he called somebody that both of us knew, and he says, when I called them, the first thing I said was, hey, buddy, I'm not trying to sell you anything. And the reason he chuckled about that was because we'll get contacts with people that we went to in college, and we're like, oh, they messaged me. I feel so loved. And then as you begin to read the message, it's like, I have a great employment opportunity for you that you can come and sign up for this thing. It's like, oh, you just want something from me. And that's what we do to God, isn't it? Oh, God, remember, we're tight. I need something. Now they're in distress. God, we know you. But they didn't. Israel has cast off, verse number 3, Israel has cast off the thing that is good. So the enemy shall pursue him. Those two go together. Things are not going well because they had cast off the Lord. And this is where we often are. We're so concerned at holding God accountable for being good to us instead of holding ourselves accountable to being faithful to Him, because we cast off the thing that is good. And in the following section, I'm going to get ahead of myself a little bit because I don't have time to read through it and then read through it again. We're going to read through it as we go along. But in the following section, he continues to lay out the same accusations against the children of Israel. And he couples it with a bunch of other things that they do. Things that they try in order to make everything work in their life. Now here's the thing. It's not wrong to work hard. In fact, the Bible says that you should. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 says that if a man doesn't work, neither shall he eat. Apparently in the church of Thessalonica, they're like, Jesus is coming back. I guess I'll quit my job. And then all of a sudden they needed to eat dinner, and so they went over to their friends in the church family and said, hey, I need some food. And so they weren't working. He says, you guys need to work. Work until Jesus comes back. If Jesus comes back, then you can quit your job. But until then, do what you need to do. The Bible talks about that in the wisdom literature. I gave you a passage in Proverbs 24. It's a familiar passage. I went by the field of the slothful and the vineyard of the man void of understanding, and it was all grown over with thorns. Nettles had covered the face thereof, and the stone wall thereof was broken down. And I saw and considered it well, and looked upon it, received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall thy poverty come. As one that traveleth, and thy want is an armed man. If God gives you something to steward over, it is the mark of a bad steward when it's all covered with weeds. It's all covered with thorns. It's not tended to. That's not spiritual. I gave you a passage in Ecclesiastes, and I won't read it for sake of time, but he says at the end of that passage, wisdom is profitable to direct. And earlier on, he talks about a lot of stupid decisions people make. They dig a hole, they fall in it. They trim a bush, they get bit by a snake. You know, they're not paying attention to what's happening. They're chopping up wood, and they get a splinter. You know, they get hurt. He says, be smart when you do things. Wisdom is important to live life. So I'm not saying in this message it's not important to work hard. And I'm not saying in this message that it's not important to have good sense, practical sense. It's not more spiritual to make a bad business decision just because you're going to trust God that He's going to take care of the rest. Okay? It's not more spiritual to be dumb just because you know that God's going to be there to meet your needs. However, with that in mind, in this passage, what we're going to see this morning is that people, and us, and these Israelites specifically, had the tendency to view life only through the eyes of the practical and not through the eyes of the spiritual. See, the books of history that we're given, Kings and Chronicles, it's kind of difficult to preach through the books of Kings and Chronicles because it's usually just a story of what happened, usually. And so I have to be careful to dump too much application into it that I'm not 100% sure is actually there. However, oftentimes when we're reading through these stories, this king became king, he did this, he fought this war, he spent this money, this is how it went. A lot of times the Bible inserts into it the spiritual lens. What happens, how does he define every single king? He defines the kings by the policies they make, but he defines them about whether or not their heart was right with God. Why does he do that? Because he's not going to be a good king if he's not a spiritual one. And so he can't outwork, out-policy, out-fight, out-plan, or outspend his need for God. And so even though we're just reading of the account of politics and national events, he wants us to remember that it's not just the things that we do, it's the heart decisions that we have. And we need to look back at our life and see our life through that lens. And so I was reading through this portion of the book, and I was noticing things in this passage. A lot of things they did, they worked hard at. And when we turn from God, we often try to compensate our inevitable loss of His blessing by making a lot of smart and practical decisions. We think we can outwork and outplan and outspend our need for God. And that's where the people of Israel were. And so we're going to look at this today. The work of our hands is not enough. What we can produce is not enough. And so I'm not asking you this morning if you work hard. I hope you do. I'm not asking you this morning if you try to be wise. I hope that you do. And I'm not telling you certainly to be more frivolous with your decisions as if they don't matter, because they do. I'm asking you if you're trying to outwork and outplan your need for God's intervention in your life. Well, if I have enough things, if I have enough money, if I have a good enough plan, I won't actually need God. The title of my message actually comes, and we're going to read it in a moment, it comes from verse number 6. For from Israel was it also, the workman made it, therefore it is not God. If you did it, God did not do it. You made it, so God didn't. And he distinguishes between those two. If I did it, it's not God doing it. Are you relying on what you can do or what God can do in your life? Many of us are so burdened down and stressed out and filled with anxiety, mostly because we've been trying to outwork our need for God. And so then we realize the burden of our whole life is actually on our shoulders. And we often have come to the realization, whether it's a bill that we can't pay or an answer we don't know a question we don't know the answer to, we realize at some point we actually can't carry that burden. But we still try, don't we, to outwork our need for God. So we're going to see some things here this morning. Most of my message is point number 1. So if that takes a long time, don't get stressed out. Point 2 and 3 I almost didn't put on there, but I tagged them on the end because I think they're important. So in point number 1, we're going to see 4 areas that we try to outwork our need for God, and we see the result of that. And we're going to look at this. So look, number 1, we ensure our downfall by trusting in the wrong things. And I worded it in that way because what we see is every time he brings up an area that they tried to work in, we also see how it doesn't work. And he puts those two together almost interchangeably. You tried this, and that didn't go well for you, did it? We're going to look at some of these. Letter A, we'll go through these quickly because I can belabor each one of these a long time, so I'm going to try my best not to. Letter A, politics. Politics. How do we try to outwork our need for God? Well, if I just put the right people in charge, then we'll be fine. Look at verse number 4. This is actually the first one he gets to. Verse 1 through 3 was, it's not going well for you, is it? Verse 4, they've set up kings, but not by me. And they've made princes, and I knew it not. See that progression of thought? Verse 1 through 3, everything's going bad. So what do? Well, we just need the right leaders. If we had the right men in charge, then we would be fine. Maybe they were saying they were wrong about the leaders that they put in place. Not by, they didn't do it by God. God knew it not. They were not concerned with spiritual things when they appointed their leaders. They didn't consult God about what he wanted with their leaders. And this is certainly true in our world today, isn't it? We're less concerned about spiritual things than we are about practical things. And that can go, by the way, for both parties. We can talk about how one party is so concerned about doing their own thing, they don't care what God thinks. But another party might be so concerned about the practical, we just think, well, as long as their policy's good, then I'm sure everything else will be fine. And we put a lot of trust and stock in the kings and princes that we put in charge. The thing is, I came across a poll the other week that I think is telling of where we are. Back in 2011, there was a certain poll, and I was curious because I heard it somewhere, and I looked it up, and I was able to see it for myself. There's a certain poll that they gave out in 2011, and they asked both parties, but specifically we'll talk about Republicans. They asked Republicans this question: can an immoral elected official still act ethically in their public and professional office? It's an interesting question. If you are an immoral person, you're not a good person. Can you, once you get elected to office, make good decisions? Ethical and good professional decisions. In 2011, 36% of Republicans said that you could do that. 36% said you can be immoral and still be a moral leader. In 2020, they asked Republicans the same question. And 71% of Republicans said you can be an immoral man and still be a good leader. In just 9 years, it almost doubled our tolerance for evil. Well, not the Christians. Surely not the Christians. Well, actually, no, the Christians' percentage was worse. Amongst that group, the Christian group, they started out lower. At 31% of Christians said you can be an immoral man and still be a moral leader. But in 2020, 68% of Christians said you could be an immoral man and still be a moral leader. So whether or not we like it, a lot of times our expectation that as long as you make practical decisions will still be good, our expectation of how much man's flesh can produce has increased in just a decade. We think politics can save us, I think, a lot more than we realize. I don't know about you. I'm looking forward to what's going to happen in the election, and I'm also looking forward to what the outcome's going to be. But we have to all train our minds to remember that kings and princes that are in charge are not going to be able to control the world, no matter if it goes the way we want or not. So with that in mind, how does it turn out? That's a good question. How does it go for them? Look down at verse number 8. Verse number 8. Israel is swallowed up. Now shall they be among the Gentiles as a vessel wherein is no pleasure, for they gone up to Assyria as a wild ass alone by himself. Ephraim hath hired lovers. Now remember, he uses this picture of adultery throughout the whole book. But the lovers of the people of Israel are sometimes the lovers of the gods they turn to and sometimes the other nations that they rely on. And we know this is part of what he's talking about here because Israel, Israel, decided to rely on other nations to help them and serve them and be there for them. The irony of them running to Assyria is palpable because Assyria, we know, is the one who took them into captivity. But when they first started making their deals with them, they were the enemy of my enemy. And the enemy of the enemy is my friend. Not always. They were like, okay, yeah, now you're just my temporary alliance that I don't have to worry about, and then I'll just swallow you up next. And that's exactly what happened. But they ran to Assyria for help. And he describes them as three things. They were empty vessels to the nation. They were empty vessels. They were a vessel wherein is no pleasure. The purpose of a vessel is to hold something. Monday morning, I'm going to come in tomorrow and probably waste about 10 minutes waking up with my cup of coffee. And I'll stand in the office as people go in and out, and I'll say hi to them. And I'll drink my cup of coffee. Have you ever had this? You have a cup, and you're talking to somebody, and then you look down at your cup, and it's empty. You drank all the coffee. Where did it go? None of us know. How many of you look down at your empty cup, and you actually don't remember where it went? Somebody must have stole it. I thought I had coffee in here. There is no pleasure. So we want the cup, and then we're like, oh, man. So this is the picture of this. They're an empty vessel where there's no pleasure in the vessel. The world just wanted to suck Israel dry. And then they look back and they're like, oh, you don't have anything left anymore. And I'm done with you. They were going to make an alliance. No, we just wanted to get out of you something. That's what most of the politics is now. I'm only making an alliance with you so it can help me. I'm not trying to be humanitarian all the world. World leaders are just trying to make sure their nation is fine. An empty vessel, and then he says this, they're a wild donkey that's alone. They ran to Assyria, and Assyria left them alone like a wandering beast in the desert without a home. Now you just feel sad for them. Now you're picturing this donkey with a sad face in the middle of the desert, not knowing where to go. And he says, that's what I want you to picture. That's what you've become. You went all the way up to Assyria, and they didn't give you a home to live. And next, he says, Ephraim hired lovers. They hired out nations like a lustful man hires out prostitutes, and now he has nobody. He has no love. He has no relation. He has nothing. Look at verse number 10. Yea, though they've hired among the nations, now I will gather them, most like he's saying to war, and they shall sorrow a little for the burden of who? The kings of princes. So the kings and the princes have a burden that they cannot handle. All the decisions they made, we're going to go to the Gentiles, we're going to go to Assyria, we're going to hire out new people. None of that worked. And now they have a burden that's too great for them. Nobody knows for sure what he means by burden. A lot of people think he means like the taxes that they had to come up with. In the history of the people of Israel, they often tried to make friends by paying them tribute. They would suck their own people dry, taking their money to pay to these other nations to get security, and then they would end up having nothing and then be taken into captivity. That was the story. So much for that. Do we really think that our political leaders actually have the capacity to rule the world the way that we say that they can? See, the only one that has the capacity to rule the world is Jesus Christ. And we often think that other people do. Well, they're pretty smart. I'm sure they'll be able to handle it. No, they won't. They put up kings and princes, but not by him. Politics. Letter B. What else do we rely on? Wealth. Wealth and increase. Wealth and increase. Look at the end of verse number 4. Things aren't going well, so what do? We pick leaders. That'll make it better. Things aren't going well. Look at the end of verse 4. Of their silver and gold, they've made them idols, that they may be cut off. Now, he's going to talk about idolatry, and that's kind of my point here. But remember I said the last few weeks that idols are not just other religions. Idols, you worship an idol because you worship the expected outcome that that idol is supposed to produce. So you worship the god of fertility because you want a good harvest. You worship the god of war because you want to win your battle. You worship the god of what certain kinds of gods of fertility that would end up allowing you to live in any kind of relationship that you wanted. You worship the god for an expected outcome. And so whether or not we put up images, it doesn't change the fact that we end up worshiping the process of an expected outcome that we want. And for a lot of people, it was harvest, which was income, which was their money. It says they made their images out of silver and gold. We just read over that. Like, you got a lot of silver and gold sitting in your cabinet to be used for whatever you want. Like, I don't know what to do with this. I guess I'll build a statue. Get some gold out. We have a lot of extra today. That's not the point. They worship the god of an expected outcome. So what did they do? They built the images. How did they build the images? With all of their wealth, they invested in the outcome that they wanted to have. I want a good harvest, so what do I have to do? I have to worship this God. How do I do that? I have to invest in my relationship with this God so that he will give me a good harvest. We are willing to invest our money for the expected outcome of more money that will make us safe. We'll be fine as long as our finances are good. That's what we see in chapter 9. I'm kind of going back between chapter 8 and the beginning of chapter 9. Look at verse number 1. Rejoice not, O Israel, for joy as other people. By the way, what a sad thing for God to look at his own people and say, don't be happy. Rejoice not. Well, because they were rejoicing over the wrong things. I gave you a passage in Joel. I won't read it. You can read it. But rejoicing for a good harvest was what they should have done. But he says, don't rejoice. You're not going to have a good harvest. Look back at verse number 1. Rejoice not, O Israel, for joy as other people, for thou hast gone a-whoring from thy God. Watch, thou hast loved a reward upon every corn floor. So he turns this whole thing upside down. He marries the picture with the reality. He says they've gone a-whoring from from God. They have gone and been immoral, gone into relationships with other gods instead of their God, just like Hosea's wife had been unfaithful with other men instead of her husband. So he marries that picture together. It says they loved a reward. The reward from going a-whoring. The payment for their prostitution. And what was the expected outcome from these illicit spiritual relationships they were having? The money they would get from the harvest. I'll worship this God of harvest. He'll give me something. They loved the reward where? On every corn floor. The corn floor was where you would gather the harvest together. They loved the outcome of serving this God who would give them more money. And they were willing to be unfaithful in their relationship with God to get it. Now, we had to dodge and weave our way through that picture a little bit, but the principle is fairly obvious. We honestly think in today's society that we can out-earn and outspend our need for following the Lord. If I have enough money in the bank, I don't actually have to go to church because what do I need? By the way, going soul winning and door knocking, I would much, much rather go to a poor neighborhood than a rich one. Because when I knock on the door of a rich neighborhood, the statistical likelihood of them being receptive to me drops dramatically. People with money don't need God. We can outspend. We can out-earn our need to rely on him. And so, no, I don't have time for you. I have my business to run. But embedded throughout this entire passage is the fact that their reliance on idols and their reliance on money was not turning out how they thought that it would. Look at verse number 5. Chapter 8, verse number 5. Thy calf, their golden calf, O Samaria, has cast thee off. See this picture of like divorce and throwing away? Hey, you're going to marry a relationship with these other gods, and it threw you away. They've cast thee off. Mine anger is kindled against them. How long will it be ere they attain to innocency? How long is it going to take for you to recover from these bad decisions that you're making? For from Israel was it also. The workman made it. Therefore it is not God, but the calf of Samaria shall be broken in pieces. Samaria was the capital of Israel. The kings that lived in Samaria built idols. That goes all the way back to the very first king of Israel. First thing he did. And it's so sad, too. The first king of the northern tribes of Israel, his name was Jeroboam. Not the Jeroboam of Hosea's day. This was Jeroboam the second, but Jeroboam the first. A prophet comes to him and says, listen, buddy, this whole thing is a mess. You shouldn't be in civil war, but you are. You're going to be king. And if you're a good king, you follow the Lord, you obey his word, you teach the people to do right, God's going to give you a whole dynasty of people after you. He's going to establish you. We shouldn't be where we are, but we're here now, and so if you do well, God will bless it. Now, some of you might remember, his dynasty lasted 2 years into his son's reign. His son became king, he was gone. What does that mean? He had no dynasty at all. Why? Because he chose not to follow the Lord. The first thing that he did was he built an idol in Bethel, which was right on the border between Israel and Judah, and he built an idol in Dan, which was at the top side of their nation. And he did so because he was worried that the people were going to continue to worship God and thus go down to Jerusalem, which is in the enemy camp. They're going to go down there for feasts. They're going to go down there to sacrifice. They're going to go down there to serve. And then they're going to want to stay there, and then they're going to want to live there, and then they're all going to leave our state and go over to their state, and then we're not going to have the economy, and we can't have that, so we need to have our own gods with our own feasts and our own calendar and our own worship, so they don't need God down in Jerusalem anymore. And so the first thing he does was replace God for the sake of his own policy, and he says, it's going to cast you off. Everything that you invested in it is going to break and be broken. Idolatry was their avenue for wealth. How did that go? Verse 7. They've sown the wind, they shall reap the whirlwind. It hath no stalk. The bud shall yield no meal. And if so be it yield, the strangers shall swallow it up. Now, we already read this verse, but I want you to see the connection. Look at the beginning of verse 8. Israel is swallowed up. They will truly reap what they sow. And they didn't sow good things, they will not reap good things. He says the bud has no meat. He says, you're going to plant this field. So imagine a field filled with barley. You know, at the end of the barley season, when you're about to harvest it, they all have the head at the top with the little, like, spriggy tassel things, right? Oh, that means there's going to be seeds. There's meat in the field. He says, imagine a field full of barley, and none of them have any heads on them. That's what you're going to get. You're going to have a beautifully healthy field with no grain in it. It will yield no meat. It has no stalk. That's what you're going to do. We expected it to work. The almanac said we were going to have a good season. God is not subservient to the almanac. He can give you the weather that he wants, and he can give the farmer next door a better harvest than you if he wants to. No wonder he tells them not to rejoice at harvest time. Go to chapter 9, verse number 1. Rejoice not, O Israel, for joy as other people, for thou hast gone a-whoring from thy God, and you loved a reward upon every corn floor, but the floor and the winepress shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail in her. Now look what he does. Verse 3. They shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean things in Assyria. He couples together their inability to get a good harvest by their own ways right next to captivity being taken away from the land as a whole. The land would not feed them. Now they're not even in the land. It's funny, I gave you a passage in Deuteronomy 28 when God outlines the curses and blessings on the people of Israel. He actually puts those two things together as well. He talks about how their needs aren't going to be met, their harvest isn't going to be good, they're not going to have the rain that they want, and then right after it, he immediately goes into, and you will go into captivity. Like right next to each other. Why is that? Because God not blessing your fields is just a hop, skip, and a jump away from your whole life falling apart. You need God's help for the little things and for all the things. That is the path toward everything breaking down. He starts by giving us warnings, but at the end of the day, we work so hard, and then it doesn't end up working out because we're trying to outwork our need for God. In the very last verse of that Deuteronomy 28 passage, he talks about how their sons and daughters go into captivity. Isn't that what we're trying to work for? Right? I'm working so hard. I'm going to work the overtime hours. Make sure that I have a good life for my family. You know, I'm never going to see my kids, but it's okay. They have some money. We do it because we're trying to provide a life for our sons and daughters. I'll tell you this, if you're trying to give a life to your kids through the money that you earn, you're not giving them a life that's going to help them. Number one, because that's not ultimately what they need. And number two, you're probably missing a lot of opportunities to raise them along the way. But here they were, making the money, and their sons and daughters go into captivity. So much for that. Wealth and increase. Letter C, religion. Religion. These last two are a little quicker. Religion. So they're building idols, but they decide to try the God thing again. But their altars are not actually cleansing them of their sin because they're trying to do religious things in their own way. Look at verse number 11 of chapter 8. Ephraim hath made many altars to sin, so altars shall be unto them to sin. Altars were intended to cleanse from sin, but because they were trying to do it their way, it was causing their sin to multiply. Now look down to verse number 12. He says this, I have written to him the great things of my law, but they were counted as a strange thing. They had gotten so used to not listening to God that when they heard God's word, it seemed foreign to them. It seemed out of the ordinary. Why would I do that? They said. And so they don't. It was a strange thing. Verse number 13. They sacrifice flesh for the sacrifices of mine offerings and eat it. So now they're doing the sacrificing. But the Lord accepteth them not. Now will he remember their iniquity and visit their sins. They shall return to Egypt, for Israel hath forgotten his maker and buildeth temples. They're trying to do religious things, but it isn't helping them any. Well, it's okay. I'm going to outwork my sin by doing more religious things. I'll bring sacrifice to the temple. That'll make it all better, right? That'll make God happy again. I will appease him. Look at verse number 4 of chapter 9. He brings this up in one of his little triads here. They shall not offer wine offerings to the Lord, neither shall they be pleasing unto him. Their sacrifices shall be unto them as the bread of mourners. All that eat thereof shall be polluted. Their bread for their soul shall not come into the house of the Lord. What will you do in the solemn day and in the day of the feast of the Lord? So the solemn days, the feast days, those were days you were supposed to keep the schedule. They were still keeping the schedule. They were still doing this. They were still doing the calendar things. They were still doing the feast things. They were still bringing peace offerings and sacrifices, but it wasn't the point. The prophets bring this up. Hosea has already brought this up. I don't want more sacrifices. I want your heart. And if we try to out-religion our need for actually developing a real relationship with God, it's not going to turn out how we want it to. Now, I dealt with that the last couple of weeks, so I won't deal with it too much longer, but in a strange way, our intense desire to do religious things is another way of us trying to handle it ourselves. It's the work of our own hands. Galatians, it's the power of our own flesh. I will do things that God will be happy with, and then I can live as I please. Religion. Letter D, security. Security. This just comes from one verse, but I thought I would mention it. Verse number 14. Judah has multiplied fenced cities. Spoiler, it doesn't go well, but I will send a fire upon his cities, and I shall devour the palaces thereof. Everything's falling apart. What do we do? Let's build a fence. We'll be more secure. We have more walls. We have more border. We have more defense. Then we'll be fine. That will make us secure. And he says, what's the result? A fire will come and devour the city and the palace. I thought about that, and it reminded me of Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, Sodom and Gomorrah, they went to battle. We forget about that story. Genesis chapter 14, they go to war. There's this whole battle of kings. And Sodom and Gomorrah loses. Lot and the people that live there, they get taken captive, and then Abraham steps in with his little crew of farmers, and they beat them all, and they get Lot back, and they save the day, and woohoo. But meanwhile, Sodom and Gomorrah, they lost this battle. You know, I bet you Sodom and Gomorrah, they probably made a lot of security measures right after that. Wow, that didn't go well for us. They probably made a lot of policy, made a lot of decisions, had a lot of meetings about making sure it didn't happen again, and they'd be prepared for next time. But what happens next time Sodom and Gomorrah comes up? Fire burns the city. Whatever policies they made to secure themselves for next time didn't matter. because their city just got destroyed from fire and brimstone from heaven itself. It says, well, oh, no, I don't really need, I don't need God, I just need to buy another gun. That's what I need to buy. The world's a crazy place, I just need more weapons. I'll put up another lock, we'll add another security camera. I don't know what's going to happen in our economy, so I'll just make more investments, I'll buy more mutual funds, I'll get more insurance. And then I'll insure my insurance. So I'll be perfectly secure. And that's what we do. I'm going to over-secure my need for relying on God's protection in my life. Fire can come from heaven tomorrow, and whatever gun you have, security camera, investment, or insurance won't make a difference. Something will happen, and it will be that line item in that clause tucked away in page number 72 of your insurance policy that, oh, it doesn't cover that, I'm sorry. Security. So that takes me to my last 2 points, which are little side notes at the end. Number 2, that's what we do. That's really the whole message. Before we're done, I want to give you 2 things. In our fragile state, we become skeptical of those who speak the truth. In our fragile state, we become skeptical of those who speak the truth. We don't like being told that because it hits too close to home, because we think of people that we're trying to put as a priority in our life. We think of things that decisions we've been making because that'll make us feel secure. We think of anxious moments that we've had and how we've dealt with them, and usually hasn't been spiritual. And somebody says it to us and it makes us feel bad. So we talk bad about the preacher because he made me feel bad. Look at verse number 7. The days of visitation are come, the days of recompense are come. Chapter 9. Chapter 9, verse number 7. The days of visitation are come, the days of recompense are come. Israel shall know it. Judgment is coming, and Israel's going to see it coming. And he kind of puts so that's judgment. He ends this little section with judgment, and in between he has 2 little couplets. The prophet is a fool. The spiritual man is mad. The multitude of thine iniquity and the great hatred. The watchman of Ephraim was with God. The prophet is a snare of a fowler in all his ways. And hatred in the house of his God. They have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah. He goes back and forth between 2 little couplets of principles, and they both match. The one thing he talks about is how bad they are. Their iniquity, their hatred, their corruption. He says, as in the days of Gibeah. No? Okay, Gibeah is probably the worst story in the Bible. A Levite is traveling from one city to another with a concubine, and he stays at this guy's house, and they try to come in and sexually assault the men homosexually, but instead he gives them his concubine, and she gets raped all night and then dies, and then he chops her up into 12 pieces and mails her to the rest of the tribes of Israel to talk about how bad it is. And then Benjamin harbors Gibeah, and they all go to war. They almost wipe out an entire tribe of Israel, and then they realize, oh no, we almost wiped out a whole tribe of Israel. That was bad. One city didn't come because they were too cowardly to show up to battle, and so they have all their men come down and pick up wives from the people of the tribe that's left over, and they say, they're all going to dance, and whichever one you think is pretty, go and snatch them, and then marry that one. And that's how the story ends. Worst story in the Bible. And the book ends, every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Sometimes you don't even know what you're looking at anymore when you look at society. You're just like, what? There's just no words anymore. All you have to do is say what happened, and we all go, well, that's it. I didn't have to describe that story. It was ridiculous. I didn't have to convince you it was ridiculous. And he says, you're doing the same thing. You're all becoming ridiculous, as in the days of Gibeah. And so what's the response, though? The couplet is how bad they are. The other one is, the prophet is a fool. The spiritual man is mad. The watchman of Ephraim, the person who's supposed to watch out for them, was with God, and the prophet was a snare of a fowler in all his ways. They thought the preacher was crazy. And every time he said something, it wasn't positive. It was like a snare, like a fowler would put out for birds. Read through the book of Jeremiah. Some of his messages, they're not positive. It's like, y'all are crazy, and you're going to go into captivity. Like, that makes me feel bad. Yeah, it's true, though. Remember Ahab? He went to go to battle with Syria, and he invited all the prophets that were going to tell him nice things. And he was like, I don't want to invite Micaiah. I hate him. Literally, it's a quote from the Bible. I hate him. Every time he comes, he doesn't say nice things to me. That's our response. Instead of thinking, maybe I'm wrong, we say, the person who told me I was wrong, they're wrong because now I feel bad. The prophet is mad. And that's what we do. Our reaction to our own bad decisions is to say, everyone who tells me my decisions are bad are crazy. Look at the end of verse 9. Therefore, he will remember their iniquity and he'll visit their sins. In our fragile state, we often become skeptical of those who tell us the truth. We refuse to hear. We gaslight the preacher for speaking truth to us for the sake of our self-saving face. I can't be wrong. Somebody else has to be. And that takes me to my last point, number 3. We end up back at the bottom. We end up back at the bottom. I just want to point out 2 little things that I felt bore mentioning because it hit me in the face as I read by them. In this whole passage, it keeps talking about 2 places, Assyria and Egypt. I know I'm late, but this is not a difficult, but it's a cool truth. Assyria and Egypt, Assyria and Egypt. You're going to go into captivity by Assyria and Egypt. Well, they actually would literally go to Assyria. They would be carried by Assyria, and some people did go to Egypt. But look at the terminology. Chapter 8, verse number 13. He remember their iniquity. Verse 13, visit their sins. They shall return to Egypt. Verse number 3 of chapter 9, same thing. They shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt. All throughout their history, who are they? They are the people who were slaves in the world, in Egypt, and God set them free. That's who we are. And here they are putting themselves back into the slavery of the world, and they will go right back to where they started. They will return to Egypt. He doesn't say they'll go to Egypt. He says they return. You're going to go back to where you began. When we choose to live like the world, we go right back to where we started as unsaved people. We end up back at the bottom. We reverse all of the blessings that God wanted to pour into our life, and we end up right back to where we started. The world is what we left behind. He says, don't die there. Look at verse number 6 of chapter 9. Lo, they've gone because of destruction. Egypt shall gather them up. Memphis, which is a big city in Egypt, shall bury them. Remember Joseph and Jacob? They went to Egypt for a while because they needed grain, but both of them knew this is not our home. And they said this, don't bury us here. When Jacob died in Egypt, they trekked up to Israel and they buried him in Israel. Joseph died in Egypt and he says, you're all not going to stay here because you don't belong here. So when you go, take my bones and bury me in Israel. And here he says, y'all have chosen to go back to where you started, back to the world, back to sin, and you're going to die and be buried back in Egypt. What a sad thing. I'm going to point out one more truth. Verse number 6. Memphis shall bury them. Watch, the pleasant places for their silver, nettles shall possess them. Thorns shall be in their tabernacles, their tents. Remember the beginning I said in Proverbs 24? It's good to work hard. You need to work hard. This is the right thing to do. And I read you a passage from Proverbs 24 that said, the slothful man has a field, and when he doesn't work hard, thorns and nettles cover its face. And here at the end of Hosea, this little passage, he says this, you worked hard. You worked hard not because it's right to work hard. You worked hard because you didn't want to rely on the Lord. So you spent time working hard in your politics. You spent time working hard in your religion, but not your relationship. You spent time working hard with your money. You spent time working hard with your security. And you know what's going to happen to all the stuff that you have? Thorns and nettles are going to cover its face. Watch, watch. As if you didn't work at all. The lazy man is no worse off than the unspiritual man who thinks he can do it by himself, because our flesh is truly incapable of taking care of us. When we realize there's something wrong in our relationship with God, our reaction should not be, I'm just going to outwork my need for him. I'll figure it out on my own. It doesn't work that way. And that's what Israel is trying to do. And every time he brings something up, he says, it didn't turn out. It's not going to turn out for you either. We're not the exception to the rule. The Bible is written for our admonition, so we have examples that we might not do as they did. So don't try to outwork your need for God. If you made it with the work of your own hands, it's not God. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word and how it is right to our hearts. Help us to recognize that we need to be faithful, we need to be hardworking, we need to be wise, but help us not to see those as avenues to avoid our need for you. So we ask for you to point out in our own lives where we have gone away from you, so that thorns and nettles don't cover our life, just like those who didn't try at all. So we ask for your help. We pray this in your name. Amen. Okay, a couple quick prayer requests. we want to mention briefly before we're done. Sorry it was late, but we finished, and so that was good. Almost didn't. Only a couple here this morning. Carolyn Coleman's asking us to continue to pray for our country and everything that's going on, coming up. And so continue to pray for one another and for our leaders. Brother Shellman's asking us to continue to pray for what's going on in Ukraine and his friends in the occupied territory and also for Israel. Miss Lucinda is asking for prayer for salvation of her family and some health concerns. And it looks like she's traveling this week as well, so pray that she has safe travels. And then the Hugglers are praying for their neighbor Tom, who has a leg neuropathy and loses balance easily. So pray for Hugglers' neighbor Tom, that he works through that and that they'll be a blessing to him. And Miss Sarah Smith is praying for her son's salvation and daughter's repentance and job and finances and housing, some things going on in her life. And I think that's all we have here this morning. If I missed anybody, let me know. A lot of folks going through treatments continually and all of those type of things, so keep praying for one another. Let's take these to the Lord in prayer, and we will be dismissed this morning. Father, thank you so much for answers to prayer recently. We do know of a lot of folks who are doing better, but Lord, I pray for those who are going through treatments and recovering. I think of Phil Smith and Dustin, who's still recovering from recent procedures they had. Folks going through treatment, think of the Stover's brother and the loss of their brother's son in a motorcycle accident recently. I pray that you would give encouragement to that family, and Miss Colleen still going through chemo as well. Give everybody the strength that they need through this. But these many requests we've heard from this morning, a lot of folks praying for family and friends. I pray for Miss Lucinda and her family that she's praying for and health concerns going on there. I pray that you would put your hand of blessing on her, that she would be able to be a good testimony to those around her. The same thing with Miss Sarah, things going on in her own life, but also praying for her son and her daughter as well. Help her to have wisdom in dealing with them as well and to be filled with your Spirit. We do pray for the Huggler's neighbor, that he continues to grow in his health, and they could be a help to him and encouragement to him and point him to you. And those who are praying for our country and what's going on in our world, pray that you would give our leaders the wisdom that they need, and ultimately that they would turn to recognize that our help is in you. And so we ask for your hand of blessing on them, that they would have an extra measure of making the spiritual decisions that they need to make. We put the time into your hands here this morning as we open your word here in just a few moments. Once again, give us what we need and help us to be receptive to it. We pray this in your name. Amen. Thank you all for listening. You're dismissed. We'll see you here in just a minute.